Well, for a conversation around food crisis and worsening economic challenges in Nigeria, we're now being joined by social commentator and political analyst Adio. It's good to have you on Arise News this afternoon.
Good afternoon. It's good to be here.
Thank you for being here. Yeah. Let's just even touch on, what the woman in that report, said. She was talking about, these alleviations that the government is trying to help, they're saying we're going to give people 5,000 here, they're going to send people bags of rice. That should not be the focus. That the focus should be finding a way to bring down the cost of living. Now, on the backdrop of that, how would you assess the role of government policies and the political factors in this exacerbating a food crisis? We know that the president did announce a state of emergency, based off of this issue. What are your thoughts on the policies that currently exist within this administration?
Okay, so you have three questions in one. I'll try to run through them very quickly. The first is that, I listened to the woman who spoke earlier, and she's right to the extent that social protection programs are supposed to be complementary to agricultural policies in curbing food inflation. They are not supposed to be, the focus of those policies. They are merely complementary. Even though they are complementary, I must add that they're also very important because if done properly, if they are properly targeted and led by a team of technocrats, and there's some sort of a cohesion between the federal, states, and local governments, you are likely to see the impact of those cash transfers. It's worked in countries like Pakistan when they did an import support program to deal with food inflation, and it helped to reduce poverty by 7%. It worked in Brazil. And in all of the countries that it's worked, it's because it was led by a team of technocrats. There was a strong relationship and coordination between federal, states, and local governments. It was purely driven by data. And there were certain conditions that the beneficiaries had to meet, and hence it was quite effective. So I think it's important for it to happen. But the elephant in the room is that while it is ongoing, what are the complementary agricultural policies that are ongoing to extensively deal with food inflation in our country? Now, to your second point, what is government doing? And I'm trying to be careful with this because initially, and like you rightfully said, the federal government set out clearly, I think it was in July or August last year. With a clear plan to deal with food security in the country. And to a very large extent, on paper, the plan seemed like a brilliant plan. They were going to work with smallholder farmers. They were going to improve agricultural productivity. There were targeted programs for food systems. And of course, there was a presidential CNG initiative, all targeted to deal with food inflation. Unfortunately, it would appear that from the point of policy articulation and direction, there's been a gap in implementation, or you would rather argue that the people saddled with the responsibility of implementing those policies either do not realize the urgency that is required or simply lack the capacity to deliver on the initiative. And that is quite saddening because I take, for instance, the presidential CNG initiative that is chaired by Zaccheaus Adedeji, the FRS chairman, and I think the likes of Tony Supaya from that committee. They've set about over 100 billion. And the idea is to convert many engines from diesel and petrol to CNG engines because the cost of CNG is almost 4 times cheaper than that of diesel engine. You know that most of our lorries and trucks transport food on diesel across the country. Now, if you're transporting food on diesel at 1,500 naira per liter, that is certainly going to impact on the cost of food when they get to retailers across the country. And so that initiative was put in place so as to deal with the cost of food transportation across the country. But as I speak to you today, the 100 billion is hanging. Nobody knows what is happening to it. We can't find where those monies are being dispersed. The initiatives are at a complete halt. Right? And there are companies across the country, private sector players who have the capacity, not just to set up daughter stations across the country, but to even support the government in these engine conversions to help deal with food inflation. There are a number of companies who have those capabilities. In Nigeria, the Mesovets, Elizades, these companies can do those things and support the government initiative. But it looks like the people saddled with this responsibility lack the capacity to drive the initiative. And I think the third thing that you raised, it's important to know that the principal driver of these costs is energy. And of course, the foreign exchange crisis. If the cost of energy continues to go up, if the naira continues to lose value against the dollar, then these prices will continue to hit the roof. So in many instances, it is not a case that there is not food available in the market. The problem is that you can't buy it, right? And so that for me is the real elephant in the room. How do we tackle the problem at the root cause? You know, and it's the million-dollar question. I think that what the government is doing at the moment are just reactionary measures. You know, the last time they were trying to, go to a few shopping malls to stop them for price gouging. I heard that, at some point they want to institute price controls. Price controls will not work. Of course, I support the ban on exports of certain agricultural products as a stopgap measure, because once you stop many of these things from going out, as a stopgap measure, mind you, over a certain window of time, you create surplus locally, and that might, begin to bring the prices of food down. But what I'd like to see is a more coherent agenda by the federal government, which it has actually articulated last year in July, to go back to its plan and begin implementing these plans in collaboration with states and local governments. No agricultural policy in Nigeria will work without strong coordinations with states and local governments. The only time we had an agricultural surplus in Nigeria where we even earned sizable foreign exchange from agricultural products was when we had the regions, when it was the western regions, the eastern region, and the northern region. And that's because agriculture was domesticated, right from the local government. Abuja does not have farmlands. They're in the 36 states of the country. So you really essentially cannot drive agriculture from Abuja without coordination from the 36 governments.
Which brings me to my next question. And of course, you've also answered a raft of other questions I wanted to ask as well. But you can't help but think that there's a lot of bureaucracy and over-centralization when it comes to decision-making on the agricultural sector. So, each state in Nigeria is endowed with its own unique natural food sources. Why aren't we encouraging production on a massive scale in that regard? And why is it, say, we're depending on just one major region for staples? Yeah. And they argue over, as part of the inflationary trends, the cost of transportation, the issue of incendiary, fiery moments there, where farmers are being dictated to by non-state actors, and they have to pay for protection money and all these, scenarios. And all of this is also adding to the cost of food. So what are your thoughts there? So,
listen, you've clearly defined the problem. You've put it in the right context and you framed it accordingly. And this is what worries me, because if we, sitting from where we are, can define this problem and can put the right context to it, I wonder why this is not happening at not just the federal government, but across state governments in the 36 states of the Federation. The only way to deal with food inflation long term and for the prices of food to come long term is to increase agricultural yield and productivity. To increase agricultural yield and productivity, it means the federal government, state governments, and local governments need to support smallhold farmers. And you do that by providing subsidies in terms of seeds, subsidies in terms of fertilizers, low interest loans to support productivity and to improve yield across the country. The second thing that you also have to do is to deal with insecurity, like you rightfully said. In several communities across the country, predominantly in northwestern Nigeria, farmers have to pay levies, taxes, if you like, to non-state actors before they can access their farms. I read a report 2 days ago that over 4,000 farming settlements have been sacked, largely due to insecurity. Now, you cannot be talking about dealing with curbing food inflation if the people who are saddled with the responsibility of producing food cannot access their farmlands. So that has to be a first-line charge. Food security has to be treated like a national security matter. It has to be on the table, right? And so if you cannot deal with insecurity that is stopping food production, then we're going to be running in circles, because who is going to produce this food? So that has to be ongoing, complementary to the fact that we have to improve agricultural yield. And then the elephant in the room is energy subsidies. See, I don't know how we're going to find our way around it, because you can't have any sort of real productivity if diesel is running at 1,500 per litre. If people have to, you can't. I'm sorry to say, you're not going to power your irrigation systems, to do that. You're not going to effectively transport food across the country at that. It's wishful thinking. Something has to be done. I talked earlier about the CNG initiative. They don't seem to be driving it fast enough. I don't know if you're going to provide subsidies for diesel. But what I know clearly is that with these high energy costs, it will be almost impossible to bring the prices of food down. So these things are on the table. The solutions are there. Unfortunately, like I said earlier, there's a lot of reactionary steps that are being taken, a lot of hasty decisions, when the government itself already has a clear plan and a clear direction to follow through. The only thing it should be worried about are instant measures it needs to take to buy time before many of the policies start to kick in with benefits. And what are you going to do in that stopgap measure? Yes, that's why I support, conditional cash transfers that are targeted, social protection programs, food banks, if some things that a few states are trying to do now, putting monies back in the pockets of people, subsidizing some products in the farms, that will help as a stopgap measure until the benefits of those policies begin to kick in. Unfortunately, I don't even see that these policies have actually taken off, and that is my biggest fear.
Unfortunately, we've run out of time. I was going to take you on the infrastructure deficiencies and inadequate storage facilities, even limited transport networks. But you have really hit the nail on the head, and I hope the government is listening. Thank you so much for your time, Adio, who is a social commentator and political analyst. We appreciate your analysis today on Newsday.